So our next guest is Dr. Elisa Raffaella Ferrè. She is an experimental psychologist and cognitive neuroscientist. She completed a BSc and MSc in psychology at the Università degli Studi di Pavia in Italy, and a PhD in psychology from the same institution in 2012 for the investigation of multisensory integration between vestibular, somatosensory, and visual functions in humans. She was a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience at the University College London from 2012 to 2015. From there, she took up her first faculty position at Royal Holloway University of London in 2015. And since September 2021, she has been a senior lecturer and the director of the Vestibular Neuroscience Laboratory at Birkbeck University, London. So passing to Dr. Elisa, I will give you the floor.
Hi everyone, I'm Elisa. First of all, thank you very much for attending the webinar tonight, and also thank you very much to the organizer to put together such inspiring and exciting meeting. So I'm going to talk about astronaut psychology and cognition, and I will go into some of our recent data about behavioral adaptation to long-term space flight and what are the potential implications. I hope that I'm not going to scare you too much with data, and if I'm doing so, please wave to me and I will try to explain in an easier way. So first of all, let me start to say that our brain, the human brain, is an amazing object, is incredibly adaptive. This means that our brain can constantly adapt to new situations and demands from the external environment. And we are very good in doing that. So essentially, humans have been able to adapt to environmental circumstances here on Earth in an excellent way. And we call this ability behavioral adaptation, the fact that we are ready to react to what are the challenges from the external environment. Now, as we have heard in the previous talk, space is a completely different story. Advances in technology have allowed us not only to be in space, but potentially to live there. And space can be considered the ultimate frontiers to our ability to adapt to the external environment. So long-term space exploration can be a real challenge to the human health, because there are many different stressors that can affect human health: radiation, extreme temperature, the absence of atmospheric pressure, altered gravity, but also isolation, stress, and confinement into a small, limited space. Now, understanding how these factors can influence the ability to adapt to the external environment is very important. And in my research, I particularly focused on the brain response to altered gravity. And I think that this is key in order to ensure the successful and safe outcome of space mission, whether we are talking about long-term space exploration or whether we are talking about commercial space flight. So understanding how the brain responds to altered gravity, I think, is a fundamental question. So as Albert Einstein said, gravity is the first thing which you don't think about. On Earth, gravity is 9.8 meters per second square. And if you now think about that, it is a quite not so small linear acceleration. However, you can perfectly interact with gravity in all your behavior. So if you are drinking a coffee now, if you are moving around, if you are jumping for some unknown reason during my talk, anyway, you can do that in a perfect way, and your brain can adjust to this 9.8 downwards linear acceleration. So I can lift this glass of water almost with no effort, and my brain knows exactly how to send motor command to my hand in order to do a movement without effort. Now, we are absolutely great in doing this here on Earth, but as soon as we move to a different environment, a different gravity environment, such as Mars, things get much more complicated, because the amount of gravity is going to be different compared to our usual amount of gravity. Now, how does the human brain encode gravity? Well, it does that mainly via this vestibular system inside the inner ear. So the vestibular system is deep inside the inner ear, and can detect each movement of your head. Now, if you stay in an upright posture, like this one in the picture, and your vestibular system has these tiny, small little organs, which are called otoliths, which are perfectly on balance on a fluid. Now, they are on balance on a fluid and perpendicular to gravity. But let's say that you want to make a movement with your head, you are tilting your head in this way, for instance, then the situation gets quite different, because the presence of gravity is going to make a shift in the fluid, which is triggering a movement of the otolith. And inside this fluid, we have many air cells that are going to send an action potential directly to the brain and say, wait a moment, this head is no longer aligned with gravity. Well, not really in this way, but you got the idea. Now, our brain knows exactly the magnitude and direction of gravity by using this sophisticated system. And of course, the vestibular system is not the only modality that is going to inform the brain about the presence of gravity. There are also other important sensory information from vision, from proprioception and somatic system, as well as visceral. So this means that our human brain is taking all this sensory information and it creates an internal model of gravity, a representation of gravity, which allowed us to interact with the environment, which allowed us to lift and drink this glass of water. Now, as I say, this internal model of gravity is perfect for 1G terrestrial gravity, but as soon as we move in an altered gravity environment, things are getting a little bit more complicated. So we know that there are major effects of space flight on brain and behavior, and we know that from astronauts' report. There are, of course, changes in brain structure, given the fact that there is a shift in the fluid. So the lack of gravity, for instance, on the ISS, is going to create a shift in the fluid toward the head, and this is going to compress the brain structure. It has been shown that there is a reduced connectivity, such as there is a reduction in the way in which different brain areas are linked together. And this reduced connectivity is particularly in this blue area that you can see here in the brain. So here is an image of the brain, let's say, that has been cut in this way, remove the top. And then if we look into that, we can see this area here. And it's called insula, and is one of the key vestibular areas. So structural changes in the brain. And as we have heard in the previous talk, these structural changes are also combined with behavioral changes. For the first hours, days, and sometimes weeks, there is a very strong space motion sickness, which has been called space adaptation syndrome. So up to 80% of astronauts during the first period of time in the space flight, they experience a very strong motion sickness, nausea, vomiting, but also perceptual illusions and disorientation. Now, if you take all these different aspects, it's pretty clear that they can impact the performance of the crew in a significant way. And we know also that there are several sensorimotor alterations, both in how the senses are processed, but also in how the motor commands are done. So here you can see, for instance, astronauts try to walk on the lunar surface, and you can see that even such a easy action for us, which is walking, can be strongly affected by a different amount of gravity. Now, it has been shown that there are changes in how we perceive the position of our body in space, which is called proprioception. There are changes in vision, which can get a little bit blurred, given the fact there is compression of the visual nerve inside the brain. We know that there are alterations in the balance, locomotion, and the coordination. There are changes in the way in which grip is exerted, the amount of force that you need to make a grip movement. And there are also problems in terms of eye-hand and eye-head coordinations. On the top of these sensorimotor alterations, there are, of course, cognitive alterations as well. It's not easy to deal with a different G load. And perhaps not surprising, there may be cognitive effect, psychosocial issues, as well as psychological issues. So if we look at this big picture, I think it's quite clear that we need to find a way, we need to understand what happened to the brain and behavior in order to provide the brain some support during space flight. And in particular, if we are talking about long-term space flight as well as commercial space flight. So this is essential in order to ensure a good human performance during missions. Now, my research is looking into how altered gravity is affecting brain and behavior. And we do so by combining traditional space research methods, such as exposure to altered gravity on parabolic flight and human centrifuges, but also by doing quite a lot of lab studies. The reason why I do like to do a lot of lab studies is because then we can have a larger sample of participants as well as gender balance sample, as highlighted in the previous talk, and we can perhaps look a little bit more in depth into some of these mechanisms. We have recently been looking at how pain perception is changed by exposure to altered gravity. And the reason why we decided to focus on pain is definitely not random. So pain is another critical sensory modality, which has a very important adaptive function. It can protect our body. It can protect our organism. So we wanted to look at whether pain, and acute pain in particular, might change after exposure of altered gravity. And to do so, we have used a short exposure to head-down bed rest. So in head-down bed rest, you have participants on a 3D tilting table. They are attached on this table, and then we can passively displace them in different orientation. And in the control condition upright, participants are indeed upright, in which the head and the vestibular organs are in a position that is coherent with the direction of gravitational acceleration. While in the head-down bed rest, you can see here that the head is slightly lower than the feet, is 6 degrees lower than the feet. So we have participants in these two orientations, and then we measure their pain threshold. So we apply pain on the fingertip, and we ask participants to tell us when these stimulus start to get really uncomfortable, clear, painful. And as you can see here, there was an increase in the pain threshold. So each dot is a single subject. And overall, there was a significant increase in the pain threshold, which means that participants were feeling less pain. There was an analgesic effect when altered gravity was present. Now, we wanted to look further into this effect by using a different type of gravity simulation, which is a virtual reality simulated gravity. Now, we started to use virtual reality because I think that virtual reality is really cool. It's really a nice tool that we can exploit for this type of studies. Now, during virtual reality, the brain can easily get tricked by the virtual reality scenario. It's called visual capture, the fact that the brain can engage a lot with the virtual reality simulation. Now, we block the head of our participant, such as that vestibular cues are going to decay over time. They are not any longer so salient, and the brain can trust what it's going to see into the virtual reality scenario. And here, essentially, we simulate terrestrial acceleration or Martial acceleration. And we have measured the pain threshold while participants were looking at these terrestrial gravity or Martial gravity. And we found, again, an analgesic effect, such as that when participants were tricked to believe that they were on a different G level, on a different G load, they were feeling less pain. Now, this may be possible because of a conflict between the online sensory information and this stored internal model of gravity that I was mentioning at the beginning of my talk. Now, I would like for you to keep in mind that I don't necessarily think that being a superhero in altered gravity with feeling not pain is something good. Actually, it can be quite dangerous in terms of protecting the organism against external event. So we also wanted to look into the motor responses to environmental stimuli. It's very important to be fast in responding to stimuli from the environment. And we have used here something that in neuroscience we call auditory oddball task. What does it mean? It means that if you are a participant, you are going to listen to a train of several beeps sounds, hundreds of beep sounds. And 25% of time, there is a beep which is with a different pitch. So let's say that the train is low pitch beep sounds. 20% of time, there is a high pitch sounds, and you need to press a button as quickly as you can when there is this audible stimulus. It has been shown that if we do this task into an fMRI scanner, several brain areas, the areas here in yellow and red, are activated, which means that our brain strongly engage with the task because it's important for us to respond to environmental stimuli as quickly as we can. So we need to pay a lot of attention in order to do that. Now, we have done this audible task in head down bed rest, and what we found is that participants were much slower in responding to stimuli when they were in the head down bed rest condition compared to when they were upright. And similarly, the same result was present when we simulate different G load using virtual reality. So on one side, in terms of sensory motor processes, I show you here that there is an analgesic effect. People are feeling less pain when they are in a altered gravity condition. On the other side, they also are slower in responding to environmental stimuli. Now, what about high-level cognition? We also focus on high-level cognition in these lab studies. And we have shown quite recently that there is an impairment in decision-making. So we ask participants to perform a task in which they need to be as random as possible. They need to generate novel behavior. Again, this is an implicit task. They need to generate sequence of numbers and try to be as random as possible. However, when they were in the head down bed rest condition, the randomness was not really there, and they preferred to go for routine, stereotype type of behavior. And of course, this is not the right strategy for the task, but they did prefer to stick to one type of behavior rather than engage in novel behavior. So the decision-making overall was significantly suboptimal. And when we look at whether not only decision-making is affected by altered gravity, but also the willingness to take risk, we surprisingly found that people in head down bed rest were much more happy to engage with the risk. So again, we used an implicit task, which is pretty famous in experimental psychology and cognitive neuroscience, in which you ask participants to decide whether, okay, so let me explain you a little bit more the task. So you have participants in front of a screen, and then every trial is a kind of balloon that they need to pump. So every time that they pump this balloon, they can gain some money. And they can do that for several times, but randomly, completely randomly and completely unpredictable, the balloon can just explode and they won't get any money. So there's no way to predict that. You might win some money or no money at all because the balloon explodes. Now, this is an implicit task, and we can then look at the number of pumps and see what is the tendency of our participant in terms of taking risks. And when we have done this task, we found that the number of pumps, so the willingness to take risk, was significantly higher in head down bed rest compared to upright control condition. So to sum up this part of my talk, we have shown that there is a suboptimal decision making, but also an increase in risk-taking behavior. So in conclusion, I think it's important to keep in mind to look into the brain and behavior when we are planning long-term space flight as well as commercial space flight. Behavioral adaptation is crucial in order to ensure the success of these missions. So it's not trivial to shift from one gravity model to a different gravity model, whether it is the ISS, 0G, whether it is the lunar, or whether it's the Martian gravity. So we need to keep in mind that it takes time and effort for our brain to adjust to this different gravity environment. It's not automatic, and it cannot be really neglected. And in particular, it cannot really be neglected when you also put into the equation the delay in communication. So it's even more important to ensure that there is support for our brain when there is a long delay in communication with ground control. Now, we have done quite recently a review of the published literature on the effect of spaceflight on brain and behavior. And we have identified 3 clusters that seems to be mainly affected by altered gravity: the sensorimotor, the cognitive, and social affective cluster. Now, when we have looked at the effect size of the effects of these behavioral changes, we found that the effect size was much higher for the sensorimotor cluster compared to the cognitive and the social affective. So to say that in other words, this means that the functions that get affected much more are the ones related to sensorimotor processing rather than cognition and social affective aspects. So it's even more important to support the brain in order to ensure a good sensorimotor control, a good vestibular processing, a good vestibular sensory integration, in order to then prevent cognitive and social affective issues. So I hope that I convinced you that gravity is not just a simple sensory signal. It's a very peculiar one. It does not produce a conscious sensation such as all the other sensory modalities. It's completely different compared to vision, touch, or auditory. We cannot really perceive it, but it's there. Actually, it's always there, and our brain is always receiving gravitational information via the vestibular organs, and it cannot just be treated as a background signal. Gravity and the vestibular system are completely different compared to the other sensory modality. The vestibular system is fully myelinated at birth, and also is fully functional even before birth, which seems to suggest to me that can be an absolute reference for human brain and for human behavior and cognition. Now, to conclude, I think it's important to think about how to ensure long-term space flight as well as commercial space flight, how to ensure the success of these new venues. And I think there are 2 main components. The first one is the flight preparation. We need to develop fast, effective training to support our brain, as well as we need to develop some support during in-flight. Now, we have developed over the past year support for all the other physiological aspects, bones, muscles, exercise training. So probably we should come up with something that is also supporting our brain. And on that note, I would like to thank you very much for the attention. And of course, I'm going to thank you, the people here in my lab, Maria Gallagher, Ikra Rashad, and Gabriele De Maio, who did the experimental work. And thank you so much.